Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to thank and pay our respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Doing Well, the Wellbeing Science Insights Podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Blue Ngo, coming to your ears from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. Let's learn together.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Doing Well, the show where we talk about all things the science of well-being. So today, I'm very excited. I'm going to talk to Kim Meidenbauer about connectedness to nature. And if you tuned in last week, you might find out that Kim is actually a colleague of one of our guests. So that's very interesting. If you remember Kate, or we call her Catherine E-Shirts, Kim is her colleague, and we found out the day of the recording with Kate that they're colleagues. So this is really fun because they talk about very similar things, but from very different angles. So Kim, thank you so much for joining us today. And just before I throw over to you to introduce yourself, I would love to share with our audience that Kim is the perfect guest to talk about this because she is an assistant professor at Washington State University in the Department of Psychology and the Health Equity Research Center. Thanks for joining us, Kim, and please tell us a bit more about yourself.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Lou. It's really, I'm really excited to talk with you guys today. I am a social, cognitive, and environmental neuroscientist and psychologist, which is a lot of things, but basically means that I am generally interested in how people's mental health, their well-being, how their brain activity and their emotions and behaviors are all affected by different things in their environment. So that's kind of the gist of what I study, and I study a lot of different things under that massive umbrella. But I'm really excited to talk with you today, and I'm super stoked.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's really good to know about your professional background and know that you're the really great guest for today. But I was telling you earlier, I really love reading your bio because it has that personal touch that I really love because I'm a cat owner as well. And you have cats. I was kind of like, yeah, we're vibing. We're gonna have a great conversation,
totally.
you know? So yeah, really, really glad to have you here. And maybe we'll be able to talk about cats in a little bit, which I'm excited about.
I sure
maybe.
Hope so. I do have like a cat themed mug going on right now.
Oh, wow.
And they will probably Zoom bomb at some point. There will be cat moments. I am certain of it.
Yeah, totally. I should actually bring a cat mug to the studio. Now that you told me that, I'm like, you know what? That's a good point. I'll like print a mug with all my cats on it.
It's
cool.
also my identity, so it's like important to me that people know. You know.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I walk out on the street and everyone would know because I'm covered in fur. Like that's just that's my move. I wear black and it's always covered in fur. Yeah. So, like I'm a proud cat owner. I don't mind.
Heck yeah.
Okay, cool. So now I'm going to get our audience to go into this section we called Have You Met Kim? And we know a little bit about you, but I find that we learn so much more about a person when you learn about what they like, what they recommend, what they've been doing. So these are our prompts. We have 5 things that we want to throw around. And I normally ask my guests to share a recommendation, or if there's no recommendation, they can just share, the first thing that pops into their mind. So the first one I want to ask you, my favorite question is, what is a book you would recommend?
God, okay. I can't choose one. Can I give one?
Multiple?
Subgenre? Can I give you a non-fiction? A fiction?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Let's do that.
Perfect. Okay. Because, I'm like such like a book lover, so I really struggle to rein it in. So I would say starting with nonfiction, and this is actually a book I really recently read. Like I read it a couple of months ago. It's called 4,000 Weeks by Oliver Burkeman. And you're nodding, you recognize it. Yeah. So it's like time management for mortals. And it's just like,
Yeah, I love
it's not time management at all. It's like, take advantage of the time you have on this planet because it's limited. And really it's like, I just loved it as like a way to like mentally reframe. And I think I tend to get really like caught up from time to time in like the daily grind and like trying to be super efficient. And that book is kind of like, there's no amount of efficiency and planning that can make you have complete control over your time. So stop trying to control time and just roll with it. And I've really taken that to heart. So I'm telling all of my friends about that book right now. That's my go-to.
Yeah. I love it.
It's such a good book. And then I would say for fiction, probably my favorite would be Fahrenheit 451. It's just like a classic book, and it in some ways, like, I feel like it's pretty similar to 4,000 Weeks. It's like,
really?
So I mean, I think there's like parallels. There's the whole thing about wanting to like, be distracted out of, thinking, and it's like trying to make people, be distracted so that they don't have time to think. And I feel like there's like a lot of parallels between kind of like the issues of modern life and not giving ourselves time to stop and reflect, and kind of that kind of overarching theme of Fahrenheit 451. Like, if we could think deeply, then we would be more dissatisfied with just all the distractions, that are kind of, so those two I actually think of as being kind of similar, but maybe that's just how my brain works.
No, that's interesting. I've never heard about that fiction, but I liked how you compare the two books and you find the similarity. I'm gonna have to research that book.
It's really good. It's like older. It's very like, it's like a classic. It's so good. But then also, because I love reading for fun, I feel like I need to plug pretty much anything by Neil Gaiman, Matt Haig, or Madeline Miller. Those are the people I'm obsessed with lately. So
I love Matt Haig as well.
So good. So good.
Totally agree. I know. Couldn't agree more. I really love 4,000 Weeks. I believe that there were a couple of months last year I just kept talking about that book to every single person I was meeting. So good. It is so good. Yeah. I want to read it again now. Because totally. I think it's better to read deeply as well. So just kind of find new nuggets. And it's a good reminder that you can just get every now and again. I think I heard when I talked about that book, someone told me that they would read it every year. Like once a year, they need to read that book. And I was like,
you need a reminder.
That's actually good. Like, that's a good point. Totally. Because you're getting that reminder every time. And that's the point of reading, I think. It's not about reading more books, but actually remembering what you've read. Yeah, and that's my struggle. So interesting. Okay, I'm gonna.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I was saying I'm gonna have to read Fahrenheit 451 because
so good.
That sounds so interesting. Yeah. Sorry, you were saying.
I was just gonna say, I also think that with a book like that, where it's like, so there's so much goodness in it, and also like, I think my default is to like slip back into kind of like old habits where I'm like planning and efficiency, and so I think rereading it is like, oh, I needed that, like, to be reminded. My once a yearly, let's reset and rethink about things, I feel like is probably gonna be good.
Yeah, totally. Any other book recommendations? I feel like you have many.
I have so many, but if I stand out further, the whole podcast.
We're gonna go down a rabbit hole. Hey, okay, that's all right. Let's talk about a movie. What is a movie you would recommend? A movie you love, or just something you watched recently that you want to talk about?
Yeah, so I mean, probably like I would say my all-time favorite movie is probably Chicago, like the musical. And I just like love, so I saw it when I was really young for the first time, fell in love with the music. I also lived in Chicago. I just moved to Washington a few months ago, but I lived in Chicago for 8 years. So I have this like really strong affinity with the city. And it's just such a good movie. It's so entertaining. It's an Oscar winner. It's everything. I love it. Highly recommend it if you haven't seen it. Even if you don't like musicals, it's a good movie.
Ooh,
Yeah.
interesting. Well, I
Yeah.
do love musical, but I've actually never watched that one. I get so
Oh,
many
yeah.
good
You
recommendations on this show. Yeah, I have to. I have to.
do. Yeah.
Chicago musical. See,
Hmm.
I'm saving it right now. Don't you worry. I'm going to
Beautiful.
save it
Good.
right now so I don't
Good. Good.
forget.
Good.
All right. Next one is a must ask on the show. You're on the podcast right now as a guest, but I wonder which podcast you listen to on the daily or maybe just, every now and
Yeah.
again.
Yeah. So I would say I went through like a real like basically I got tuned into podcasts when like Serial came out, however, like 2014, whenever that was. And like I think podcast became a thing. And then I kind of obsessively listened to them for like since then. And I've fallen off recently, but I have like so many podcast recs. But I think I'm going to narrow it down to like the ones that I feel like I really got a lot out of and really like stuck with me. So I think from like, because I'm just like a nerd at my core, I love Science Versus, which is, I think, so you're nodding, great, just like science podcast. I love Wendy Zuckerman. She's awesome. And so I love that from like me wanting to always learn about new things. I just always like to learn. The Anthropocene Reviewed is like a very poetic podcast that I really appreciate.
Is that by John Green?
Yeah. So he like reviews. I don't know if it's still going on.
I have the book.
Yeah.
I have the book. I haven't read the book, but I didn't know that he has a podcast for that as well. That's interesting.
The podcast was like before the book, actually. So I think like select episodes basically of the podcast are in like written form. And it's so good. It's just like, let's like, Yelp review Canada geese or sunsets. And I just love everything about that. And then the other two, I'm going to choose two more. The other two are Code Switch, which I just think is like a really cool and important podcast. And like, I just love every single episode and I love the host. And then my like weird kind of one that people don't expect, I really like military history, like a lot for some reason. I don't know why. It's very consistent with the rest of my personality, I feel like. But I really like Dan Carlin's Hardcore History as a consequence. So that podcast, I always feel like it's like interesting, and it also gives me a lot of perspective. I feel like I'm like, oh wow, no matter how bad things are, do I feel like in my life right now, I'm not like in World War II as a soldier experiencing terrible things. Like my life is pretty good. And so I like weirdly use that podcast as sometimes to reset my like expectations for life, which is kind of a weird way to think of it, but it's really effective. Yeah, it's really effective. So yeah.
New perspective. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting because normally if I ask my guests about podcasts, I would say more than half of them, like, I don't actually listen to podcasts. So you're the complete opposite. Like you have so many recommendations. I love it. Thank you. I was low-key saving all of them. I was like, oh, good. Like I need to get back into listening to podcasts. Yeah. I actually don't listen to that many podcasts nowadays. So I mean, I'm loving these recommendations.
Busy doing podcasts, that's fair.
Yeah. Yeah, I love learning from my guest. That's why I stopped listening to podcasts. But I think it'll be good to hear from other shows because they have different perspectives, and it's a good way to consume content. When you're doing things, like I feel like that's more effective than just playing just playing a movie or something in the background. Like, I really need to get back into that. Yeah.
No, I love a podcast or even an audiobook, just like when I'm like doing chores or just like, doing something. Like I just like to have something like going on in the background that usually, like I can pay attention to easily and I don't have to be looking at it. I actually appreciate that a lot.
Yeah, I agree with you. Same. Okay, then next one. Who is your famous role model, or if not famous, then a personal role model of yours?
Yeah, so this, I actually really struggle to think of someone, honestly. But I think she's not famous necessarily outside of like people that know about cycling, but there's this cyclist named Jenny Graham, and she was like she was the fastest woman to ever do a bike tacking self-supported bike packing trip around the world in 2018. And so she's this like crazy endurance cyclist, and she's like Scottish, and she's like super like impressive and strong, and everything about that like obvious. But she's also got one of this the kind of like most positive and just kind of like taking life as it comes, and like trying not to sweat the small stuff, like personality. And it's just like it's aspirational. Honestly, I'm like, when I grow up, I want to be Jenny Graham. She's just so like always taking in like her surroundings and appreciating where she is. Like if you ever see a documentary with her, which there's a number of them, it's just she's living her best life. She's like, you know, living out of a backpack, but she's having the best time doing it. So yeah, I like have mad respect for her, and I want to be like her, basically.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I've never heard this name before, but now that you've mentioned it, I'm curious. So yeah, that's the whole point. You're getting curious about new things. So thank you for that.
For sure.
All right. And finally, what is a course you've completed that you want to talk about? I mean, you're an assistant professor, so I'm keen to hear what you want to talk about here. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, things like I haven't like taken courses now in so long. But there's actually a course that I was a teaching assistant for in grad school. And it was like it was the first time the course was ever being developed. I was kind of helping the instructor a little bit more in the creation of it than normal. And it was this like public policy class. And so I don't know why, as a psychologist, they were like, yeah, this is fine. You can teach this, psych PhD student. But they did. And I was really glad for it, because it was the first time that I'd seen like a class so focused on like, okay, here is science, and here is what we can use. Here's what we can take and learn, and then apply it to like meaningful policies. And just kind of seeing how the professor of that class, her name is Anjali Adukia, she's amazing. Harris Public Policy School, check her out. She like everything she brought up was like, so she's like, this is important research, and here's the clear link to how we can change things. And for me, thinking as like a very like basic scientist, honestly, at that point, I hadn't been thinking about how can you apply research in like very concrete ways. And that class was like just such an eye opener for me, because I was like, oh, I could really like do research that like matters and like has policy implications in like a very like concrete way. And so that class was just like really kind of broadened my horizons, thinking about what I could do as a scientist, honestly, and the impact I could have. So that was that was awesome for me.
Oh, that's so good to hear. I just love hearing people talking about things they've done with passion. You know, like I think that's very inspirational, and I'm glad to hear that it's working out for you well as well. Yeah. Thanks for that. Really, really good recommendations, really good share. And now we're going to talk about well-being. We're going to talk about barriers when it comes to connecting with nature. Very important topic. I was talking to your colleague last week, and we were just addressing how much our lives have changed, and you know how much this has impacted our well-being in general. But I'm sure you're going to have some new nuggets of information to add. So let's start with well-being. Let's start broad. What does well-being mean to you?
Yeah. So, I mean, well-being's so funny because like as a scientist, I'm like, there needs to be a definition. And it's like, there is not really seemingly a single agreed upon definition at all. So what I'm going to say is kind of what it means to me personally, which is like, for me, it's like a feeling of contentment and being kind of at peace with how things are and appreciating how things are, even if they're not like ideal. So I think of well-being as like there's precursors where like things need to be like good enough in your life, like your life circumstances need to be like adequate, right? You can't be like experiencing extreme illness or having like really intense financial insecurity or having a really stressful like home life or something. Like those things, just having like a good attitude and kind of approach are, I think, going to create well-being. But it's like assuming your situation and life circumstances are like good enough, being in the mindset to kind of weather things that come and go, and just like being okay with that, and still feeling grateful and appreciative and open to life.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's something we tend to neglect because a lot of the times we look at someone and we're like, oh, this person's well-being must be good, but we don't know what's going on inside. We don't know
Do
about
not.
their circumstances. I agree with your personal definition, and I think it's true. I don't think there's one single definition that would apply to everyone because it's
Yeah,
so different for each of us.
totally.
Um, so it's good that you pointed out that, we need to have that certain balance in our lives where we need to be at a state where we're comfortable, but also sort of thriving.
Totally.
So what are some of the misconceptions that you've seen in others? Obviously as a scientist, you can talk from a research perspective, or you can just say from your observation regarding people that and you just kind of see, oh, like that person's getting well-being really wrong.
Right.
What are some of the misconceptions that you noticed?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like there's this idea, and I think this is in part I think it's partly because like of the way that a lot of us present ourselves on social media and like only showing the good moments. I think there's this idea that you just need to be happy and positive like all the time, and I just don't think I don't think that's realistic, and I don't think it's true of most people. So I feel like I don't think that people that have a high sense of well-being have to be just like constantly happy. I think that there can be like fluctuations, but as long as they're like able to cope when things kind of come up, I think that's pretty key. And I think that, I know, I think there's a lot of things I think people think will make them happy that ultimately don't. I mean, there's like, research on, well, there's like the famous study that's like, oh yeah, the research shows that up to $75,000 a year money can buy you happiness. And then beyond that, it kind of plateaus. I actually recently read a paper that was just like kind of replication follow up on that. And basically what they found is that, well, actually, if you're already happy, money does continue to help. But if you're unhappy, then all the money in the world can't make you happier. So it's like,
Yeah.
if money isn't enough. And so I think financial stability, huge, right? That's going to make it easier for you to have good well-being, but just like piling on more money to reduce unhappiness is not really going to have an effect. So I think that's one main thing. There's also just this like issue of people overestimate how much they will be affected by like negative events, and then they underestimate a lot of like smaller positive events. So like people are really bad at what's called affective forecasting. So predicting how they will respond emotionally to something that are either good or bad. And like there's lots of research showing we're like always assuming that like a bad event is going to make us so upset and totally ruin our well-being and our happiness. And it's like, oh no, actually we're pretty resilient. We tend to bounce back actually. And things like a lot of money or like buying things, we tend to overestimate, and things like spending time in nature, we underestimate. So there's like a whole, kind of connected to what we're talking about today. Like there's a study that showed that people underestimated just how much their mood would change by being in nature. So they didn't even know that would be something that would improve their mood, and it had a huge effect. So, yeah.
Oh, I love that. I couldn't agree more. On the first point, when it comes to social media, that's come up quite a bit in this show. We talked about that a lot of the time. And just to emphasize, social media is just highlight reels. You
Not
don't
real
you don't
life.
see the
No.
you don't see the stuff that happens in the low light. It's really okay
Not
if
at
you're not
all.
feeling
Yeah.
great. And well, I mean, sometimes it's funny because when you see other people having fun and you're not feeling great on social media, it kind of affect your mental health quite a bit. And I think that's why we really need to put things into perspective, because just look at our own selves, right? We wouldn't share when we're struggling most of the time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no,
And
it's like, how would you
we'll still
expect
share the
other people?
highlights.
Yeah, totally.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then the other point is also really interesting because yesterday our team, our CEO was sharing this article with our team actually about how money can affect happiness and well-being. I think I didn't get time to read it closely, but then now that you're mentioning it, it's kind of like it's kind of coming up quite a bit in conversations. And I think it's true because I think the happiest I've been, or like the time that I felt like my well-being is at its peak is not when I'm spending money, actually.
Right.
And we're talking about spending time in nature. We're going to talk about that right now, some of the barriers about spending time in nature. But last week we were talking about the good side of it, like how amazing it is for us to spend more time in nature. And it was interesting because I was sharing with Kate that I'm going to go on a hike. I think I was sharing with her. I don't remember if it was in the recording or after, but I was kind of saying, yeah, I'm going to go on a hike tomorrow or this long weekend with my friend, because we had the long weekend that just passed. And it was true, like we went on the hike, went really early in the morning, spent zero money basically, apart from the driving. I mean, my friend paid for gas, but that's different. It's like, it's a time spent just hiking, exploring, truly spending no money, not being on social media whatsoever. It was, I told my friend, I was like, this is the best day of my life. Like literally, that's what I said. Yeah, it is crazy, right? Yeah. So we was saying, like, if this is the best day of your life, we need to have more days like this. So we're gonna, let's spend more time in nature and just explore, because there's so much more to explore. And even if you've lived in a place for years, you'll still find new things to explore, for example, in nature. And we were kind of talking last week about the fact that, sometimes you don't get access to all of these things. But I think it's also a matter of perspective and priority, because we would, speaking about 4,000 weeks, we all have the same amount of time. So it's up to you entirely how you want to spend your time. So now let's talk about the barriers, because that's a bit of pretext. So obviously we know it's good. Personally, I think it's great. I know you love spending time in nature as well, because you're the expert here, and you probably advocate for this so much, especially if you bike. I think that's what you said earlier.
I bike and I hike a lot.
There you go. You definitely spend a lot of time in nature. So what are some of the structural and physical barriers to spending time in nature nowadays, according to your research?
Yeah. So, I mean, I will say that kind of a lot of how I think about structural and physical barriers to nature is kind of situated within, honestly, like a city context. So most of what I'm going to talk about won't necessarily speak to people that are like living in more rural areas, but at least in cities, which is, where most people in the world live, we see that, there's a lot of variability even within the same city, or even within the same kind of sub part of a city, in kind of the quality of nature. And so, nature could be like a city park, or it could be a greenway. It could be like a body of water nearby or something like that. And we basically know that overall, the kind of nicer, greener, more beautiful natural spaces that are in cities are also going to be the ones that are also going to be in areas that are generally very high socioeconomic status areas. So high income, wealthy areas, and disproportionately white areas relative to areas that are predominantly or majority like persons of color and community of color. So as like an example, in Chicago, which is where, I spent most of, my 20s studying and looking at kind of how Chicago as an example, which is like super segregated. It's one of the most segregated cities in the US, and like it has like a very racist history that has kind of led to this. And as a consequence, we see that a lot of Chicago's most beautiful and impressive natural spaces are on its north and east sides, which are the whitest and wealthiest essentially sides of Chicago. And like Lake Michigan, for example, it was just a beautiful lakefront in Chicago. I spent so much time hiking and biking along the lakefront path, and it was easy for me because I lived so close to it. But Chicago's west side it's hard to get to the lake from the west side, and the west side is also where you have like a majority of like the Latinx and Black residents in Chicago. And so not only is there like more physical space between some of the nicer, better green spaces or blue spaces within a city, but they're also not necessarily easy to get to via like low cost transit options. So it's kind of harder to get to the lakefront or some places from the west side and some parts of the south side. So it's not even just that places are physically further away. It's like people might not have an ability to get there if they don't have a car or if they don't have the time. And so there's these structural issues that are like very apparent. You just look at the distribution of parks in a city like Chicago. And this isn't just Chicago, like this is the case in a lot of cities in the US. And I haven't done much work internationally looking at other cities, but honestly, I would expect that there's probably an analog in vast major cities across the world. So those are like really just like structural physical barriers to getting some of these kind of like quality nature experiences within cities. And then on top of that, I will add like two other minor things. Like one, well, not minor, but two lesser points. One is that a lot of times, like really beautiful natural spaces, especially in cities, especially if they're in wealthy neighborhoods, they can be seen as kind of like a little bit exclusionary. So they're like white or wealthy spaces. And so I'm actually working on a project now with some collaborators. We're trying to investigate this question of, how can we make spaces restorative and beneficial without making them, these white, wealthy spaces where persons of color might not actually feel like they belong. And this is an issue, right? Like you don't want to go somewhere and experience nature if you don't feel like you can belong there. So that's one other thing. And then the final thing I would say is that not all nature is created equal. So if you are in the middle of a city, or if you aren't in a place that has like nearby really beautiful scenic vistas. So this is something that I feel like, having moved to Washington now, and I'm just like always surrounded by just like spectacular views. I'm like, oh my God, I didn't have that when I was living in the Midwest in the same way. So there's just like geographic barrier where it's like, if you don't live close to like just like beautiful, awe-inspiring vistas, then like you aren't going to see them unless you have the ability to travel to those places. And again, if you don't have the money to travel, you're not going to be able to go to those places. So that's kind of how I think about it in terms of the structural and physical barriers.
Yeah, well, that's a really good point, actually, because I never thought about it that way, especially because now that I have been living in Melbourne for a couple of years, I feel like we are very lucky because we have a lot of parks around, and I don't feel like I don't belong as a person of color. So I
That's
feel like
great.
it's definitely a structural issue elsewhere if people are struggling with that. And I think for me, it's actually been really good because so the city that I'm from, Hanoi, is it's very urbanized now. It's like buildings everywhere. It's very polluted. We don't have as many parks. And in fact, the parks aren't free most of the time.
Oh, wow.
So
really?
recently, like some of them, it's kind of like, it's like a amusement park sort of thing, but it's not really amusement park. And they just, people just get charged to go into these parks. And recently there's been a project going on with one of the biggest parks in the city where they just remove the barricades and, now they're going to turn that into a free park for everyone. But there's a lot of concern about safety. So what happens is, if you're from a very safe city, you don't necessarily worry about, being in the park at night, let's say.
Right.
But in a city like Hanoi, the crime rate is still kind of high. And there's a lot of risk involved, basically, because, addicts would roam around the city at night, looking for places to hang, or, like they would maybe do transactions or things like that. Mugging could happen. So when I think about that, I feel how lucky I am that I'm here. And there's the difference when I think about it, because when I was home in Hanoi, living there for over 20 years, I was kind of like not really going out much.
Yeah.
Not for a walk. I would go to the gym, but I wouldn't go out for a walk. Compared to fast forward Melbourne.
Yep.
I go on walks on a daily basis.
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
It's so accessible and it's so like well structured in that sense. And
totally.
There's just, so much around me, especially because I live in the city. So it's just really good. And now that you mentioned that, I'm kind of like, oh, wow, the differences are so big.
They're huge. Yeah. Yeah, no, it's true. And honestly, what you brought up there is another kind of, this is like a thing that I didn't bring up before, but it's a pretty crucial one, is that like, it's not even just that like the nice parks are in the wealthy areas. Like that's where some of the safest parks are too, right? Like I did some focus group work with like some community members a few years ago, and we asked them like, well, what are some of the things that make you go to or not go to parks in your neighborhood? And like, do you visit parks in your neighborhood? And like a number of them were like, well, I would actually rather just take the bus and like go to like Millennium Park in downtown Chicago, where I know it's safer and nicer. And it's like, having a park in your neighborhood isn't that beneficial if you don't feel like you can go there safely and like actually have it's not going to be a restorative experience or a boost to your mood if you're like, worried about, being like attacked or something like that. So
Totally.
Thinking about not just the presence, of there being green spaces or parks, but like, are these parks accessible? Are they safe? Do people want to spend time in them? Is pretty crucial. So so I think that's a great point that you brought up. I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, it's actually quite, like now that I look at it, it's quite concerning as well. And I can compare my level of well-being back then versus now, because I'm more connected to nature, obviously. And I didn't think about this at all until you brought this up today. Like it's not like I've done my analysis or anything. I literally just thought about that. And I think it's quite crucial for people to start noticing this thing, because sometimes when you're born and raised in a place and you don't move anywhere your whole life, you probably don't get that perspective.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
So it's good to recognize it, because you can actually take steps to change that. For example, had I not left Hanoi, I wouldn't know that I could actually enjoy life this way, just go for walks after work, or if I need a little bit of a break, I would just, like have a walk around the block to the park nearest to my apartment. And I visited my family recently. I have to say it was actually challenging. And now that I know what it is, I couldn't really put a pin on it. I was like, I couldn't really know what I felt really out of whack. I was like, I don't know why.
Yeah.
Turns out it's actually this, like it's actually the fact that I didn't get to spend much time in nature to recharge. I was basically cooped up in the four walls most of the time. Or if I had been out, it's just like, jumping on the Grab. We don't have Uber, but, onto the Grab and off to the next destination. So basically you don't get that exposure at all unless you actually go on a trip with your friends or do activities. But I think it was kind of a good point to raise, because we want to talk about how this would affect our well-being, right? So I would say, well, if you're living in a place where there are a lot of barriers, I'm guessing chances are your well-being is probably not going to be as good as somebody else who gets access to this. And sadly, a lot of that has to do with wells. Like you said, a lot of the rich neighborhood has that. And same thing in Vietnam, honestly. Like they would have these amazing gardens with guards, in these really fancy buildings or apartment buildings. And you can easily access them if you live there. Or if you pay for it. So
exactly.
It's interesting because it's structural. I don't think a single person can change it, but it's good to recognize it.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those things where it's like, not only is it, it's these structural issues. Not only do they make it so that your local close by green spaces and whatever are inadequate, you could say in some cases. But also, like wealth and a lot of other things actually enable some people to be able to change their situations. Whereas if you're really struggling, it's harder to, change your situation. If you have like sick parents that you need to take care of, like you can't move away or so there's other things that even if you realize that your neighborhood is not optimally designed for your well-being, right? For X, Y, and Z reason, including the like poor nature, you also have to have the means and opportunity to actually make that change. And that's another structural issue that is tightly linked to things like wealth, at least in the US. So it's a tricky thing. And then kind of what you were saying there about like, oh, this is what I realized I was missing. Like that is a thing that I think was also observed a lot, I think, during COVID, like the drop in well-being, everybody was inside, nobody was spending time in nature. And in Chicago, at least, there was this like huge thing where like the Chicago's lakefront got basically blocked off because of COVID. Like people weren't going outside, so it was basically the lakefront was just shut down. And so
wow.
this normal source of nature for most Chicagoans that are somewhat on the eastern half of the city suddenly shut down. And it didn't work out well. It was pretty bad. Like we didn't know at the time that outside was okay, so it's like easy in hindsight, but it had a really major impact on the city residents. And there was also research by one of my colleagues at University of Washington, and they basically showed that COVID also restricted access disproportionately for people of color to nature. So it's not even just that like COVID had this negative impact on getting all of us access to nature because we were in lockdown. It was that this was even worse if you stratified by someone's, socioeconomic status, for example. So it's like there's all these like levels of structural issues.
I see.
Like, all the things. It's great if you can make those changes. And like I love that you went to Melbourne and you now have this like amazing access. That's like so awesome.
Yeah.
But it's tricky too when like not everyone can. Like I also feel very fortunate that I've been able to move, but not everyone. Not everyone has that.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So we can talk about some little strategies or practice that we can incorporate into our lives in a little bit, because it is a problem. And obviously, as I said earlier, I don't think one single person can change the structural issues, but we can do what we can for our own well-being. And at the same time, I'm hoping that this will open up a bigger conversation for researchers, for policymakers, because I don't know, like now that I think about it, I'm just really grateful for Australia because I don't feel excluded. I don't feel like I'm unsafe when I'm out in public. And I do know that it's a very big issue in the US because I have a lot of friends who live there. And I just find that to be fascinating because, like it's supposed to be, the dreamland where people just get all of the best, right? But actually for those that don't know, well, it's not. It's not like that, right?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Not even a little bit.
Yeah, well, it that could be a whole topic in itself. But
true. We could go on.
You touched on this earlier. You talked a little bit about the aspect of wealth. Because, it depends on your personal circumstance, how much you can afford and whether you actually have other responsibilities and commitments in your life, because that'll affect how you're going to have access to all of these things. So we talked about a little bit of that. And I wonder what else is there, because we talked about the structural level, and now let's take it to the individual level, because the individual level would open up much more.
Totally.
This
Those
is the struggle, right?
Totally.
Like this is a struggle that everyone could probably relate to. So material, and you mentioned cultural as well. So I wonder what else would be some of the barriers that would stop individuals from having access or just being close to nature.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say like the first thing is that like it's kind of what I mentioned before, that people underestimate that the benefit, you underestimated the effect that your hike would have on your emotional well-being. That is a key one. Like people are deciding what they want to spend their time on, and they're systematically undervaluing the kind of experience that they could be having in nature. And so, it's essentially like assuming that someone does have the time and a variety of activities they could choose. One of the main things is that they probably don't realize how much they will feel better if they do spend time in nature. And, it's one of those things like the more you do it, probably the better you'll get at realizing this. But for the majority of people, it seems like we don't really know just how much of a benefit it will be. So I think it's just one of those things that kind of, it gets deprioritized. It's not like the go-to thing that I think some people, especially if you're, if you don't have like a easy to get to, natural place, it's just not the thing that comes to mind for, I would say, a lot of people. And then there's also kind of this, I don't know, this is something so I grew up in cities, like this is, moving to Pullman, Washington. This is the first time I've ever lived in like a town or anywhere that isn't an urban environment. And kind of through doing this like nature research, and my spouse is actually like much more kind of like had experience in like hiking and camping and stuff than I did. I kind of learned in recent years, but I also sort of it does sometimes feel like there's a bit of a barrier to entry. Like you need to like, you want to go for like a hike in like a nature preserve. There's like, do you like need to know about like, where do you park? Oh, there's a fee to go here, and like here's how you navigate a trail. And so like, kind of more immersive nature experiences, I feel like there's like a base level of knowledge that you kind of need to have that you wouldn't necessarily already have. So it's like there's a little bit, I would say, of like a barrier of entry in terms of like knowledge and expectations, which can be easily overcome, especially if you can do it with someone who's done this before. It sounds like your friend drove, so maybe she'd done this more recently or more often. But I think having someone who kind of like knows how to like navigate through a like forest preserve, that's like a big one, right? Like I'm terrible with directions. I'm really grateful that like all trails exist and I can look at my phone and be like, where the heck am I? But so there's those kinds of like, just not feeling comfortable, not feeling like what to do, and then just under prioritizing or deprioritizing nature as a source of enjoyment, and as a source of like pleasure is, gonna ultimately be unfortunate, because it does provide so many benefits. It's so good for us, but we don't necessarily assume it will be.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it depends on the people you surround yourself with as well. If you're not the kind of person that are comfortable, exploring by yourself. I actually just took the train to the Dandenong Ranges, and I did that like every other month or so because I just love being there. But I have friends that just aren't comfortable doing that by themselves, and I'm just kind of like, it's okay. Like you can do it, by yourself, you can do it. But then, the friend that went on the hike with me, we didn't know where that place was. We'd never been there before. And he was driving and then he was like, I don't think we're in the right place. And I was like, huh? Because we kept going and there was like no entrance because it's supposed to be this park. And then he's like, dude, I think we're not there. And I was like, huh? So there was no Google map working because it's in that remote area.
Yeah.
But here's what I love. And here's why I emphasize that you should surround yourself with people like that, because adventurous people and, people that are open to talking to others. I actually, the bad thing is I don't talk to other people. Yeah. Like if I struggle, I'll just Google.
Yeah,
I don't like talking to people. But it was actually really good on that hike. And I feel like this is something we can try, more of. I'm encouraging myself to try more of this as well. So
yeah, love that.
We were driving, he was driving, and then he couldn't see the entrance anywhere. And then we saw cars coming through, and then there was this lady, she was kind of like going to the gate that we finally found. So he was really quick in figuring out what happened. And he was like, okay, I don't think this is the gate. The other way is the gate. Let's go back. And honestly, throughout this whole period, I was like, I have no idea what you're talking about. Like, I did not see any gate. I do not know where we're going because, I didn't drive. Maybe that's why I didn't notice.
Totally.
But when we got there, the gate was closed, right? So this is like another funny thing. A lot of people might just turn around because it's closed.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Of course.
Yeah, because it's like it's close. It's like the long weekend, but then he went to talk to that lady, and then apparently the park opens later than what Google Maps said. That's it. That's the whole reason.
That's the whole thing.
Oh, all we needed to do was wait. So see, this is important as well, because I feel like culturally speaking, a lot of kids were raised in a way that just make them scared. Yeah, myself included, I think, sometimes. And I feel like surrounding yourself with people that are more adventurous, that are more open-minded, that can maybe a bit more extroverted than you, and are willing to kind of like go the extra mile to find out what's happening and make friends on the road. I feel like that's really awesome. Yeah. And that story is kind of how I'm thinking about my whole upbringing, and leads me to my next question, because I realized that, okay, maybe that happened because of something that was on with me. But another thing that we need to talk about is children, their engagement with nature, because children would then become adults. And,
Yep.
like if you don't nurture that spirit when you were younger, chances are when you grow up, you're not going to do that. And I'm guessing the friends that are hesitant to go on hikes by themselves or explore by themselves had that experience because of their childhood. So our next question to you would be the behaviors of parents. How would the behaviors of parents actually influence their children's frequency of nature engagement? This is, I think it's probably going to be clear. I'm guessing, if parents are taking children out more and explore more, they will grow up to be really adventurous and, adults that are engaging with nature much more. But there might be something else that we didn't look at. So what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah. So, I mean, like, I think the obvious answer is like, oh, well, parents, taking their kids to the park. So their kids are spending more time in the park. And then they learn that they like parks and, or nature. And then, that becomes value. But interestingly, so I actually did a study a few years back now where we were looking at the environmental preferences of kids from basically 4 years old to 11 years old. And then also their parents. And we had them do a task where they were basically like sorting and rating different types of environments in terms of how much they liked them. And we had all of these like preferences for these different nature and urban spaces for kids, and then also for their parents. And we did find that like if you looked at how similar were the child's preference for different spaces compared to their parents versus all of the other adults in our sample, we basically found that kids overwhelmingly looked more like their parents than any other random adult, essentially. And then on top of that, that relationship actually got stronger with age. So the 4-year-olds, they looked more like their parents than other parents, but there was still like a bit of a disconnect. But by the time we got to our 11-year-olds, they're looking really similar. Their preferences are looking really similar to that of their parents. So this suggested to us that, the parents' preferences and environmental preferences are playing a key role in driving the children's preferences, at least up until 11. So I don't think it's a huge leap to say that, what the parents prefer and what the parents are doing are going to have an impact on kind of the children's own preferences, which, may or may not change as they get older, but, at least you have that kind of like foundation, hopefully, of like appreciating nature. And I don't do this research, but there's, kind of like a whole other separate field of like nature-based play and nature education. And a lot of that like talks about why like nature is so beneficial for kids and like how it does allow you to like increase like exploration and adventure and safety, like safe risk-taking kind of thing. So I think there's a lot of benefits for it, but it is interesting. And it's interesting, kind of like what you were saying, where it's like, it's also just like, if you didn't grow up somewhere where there was a lot of those, like maybe the parents don't even have a park to take their kids to, which is an unfortunate thing. So yeah, we would hope, but it's another one of those things where there might be structural barriers as well.
Yeah, I mean, totally. Because now that I look back on my childhood, it was kind of like a privilege going to the park.
Totally.
Here it's kind of like the norm. And I'm like, oh.
Exactly.
No, it's interesting.
Exactly.
Like I'm rewiring my brain.
Yes, totally.
As I'm growing up, like it doesn't matter how old I am. But yeah, I think it's super important because I look at my nieces and nephews and I just don't see them engaging with nature at all. Like they're mainly just indoors studying or, they would go to their relatives' places at weekends and they might go out or they might go on a vacation a year, but that's the extent of their exposure to nature as much as I see. Because it's, as I said, it's a very urbanized city in Hanoi now. It's full of buildings and it's highly polluted. It's not accessible, not that accessible to go to parks and things like that.
Totally.
So yeah.
And honestly, yeah, definitely. And I think like the other kind of like the main thing actually of that study that I mentioned that we found that was surprising was that like actually overwhelmingly kids preferred the like urban spaces we showed them. So like kids didn't actually prefer the nature pictures or in like spaces overall. They actually prefer the urban ones. And so it's like, but they still benefited from it. So it was like kind of the way that we were thinking about this is like, okay, parents, you should probably drag your kids to some nature. They're not going to want to go based on what we're showing. Like overwhelmingly on average, they're not necessarily going to want it as much as you might, but it's good for them. So, force them. And that's easy for me to say as a non-parent, but.
Yeah, same. I know parenting is hard. I'm not going to discount that, but I just think I'm concerned right now because my nieces and nephews don't get as much access to nature as they should at this age, because they're growing up, they're learning about the world, and it's just good to kind of like grow to love nature. And I would love to hear from you. Final question is about affective benefits of nature.
Yeah.
I was telling you earlier, I read this word and I'm like, I read the definition. I was kind of lost. I was like, I don't really know what this is about. I'm guessing it's going to convince a lot of us and educate us at the same time, because I don't think everyone is aware of this. So could you please enlighten us? What are the affective benefits that nature provides?
Yeah, absolutely. So the thing that's confusing is affective is a word that I feel like a bunch of scientists and nerds like myself use a lot, but most people in their daily lives do not refer to emotions as affect. It's a very distinctly like nerdy scholar word. So I'm talking about the emotional benefits of nature, just to like make sure everyone is clear, the affective benefits. And yeah, it's astounding the amount of research that has honestly been done about all of the emotional benefits that nature has, like just decades of it. And kind of the most robust findings that we've seen based on things like meta-analyses, which are aggregating a lot of different studies results to try to draw some stronger conclusions. Like you see really real and robust increases in positive emotional states, especially right after some sort of interaction with nature. You see slightly less. You also see a decrease in negative emotional states, but it's a slightly like smaller effect overall. But you do see, at least like in the short term, people tend to be in a better emotional state. So even if it's just for a short time, which is usually when these studies are done, you see these kind of very acute but strong short-term effects. You can also see an actual physiological change is the kind of other main thing. So there's this like whole body of research on how nature can reduce stress. And so you can ask people about their, self-reported stress after they interacted with nature. And I'm saying interacted with nature, and this could be like went for a walk, did some sort of like forest bathing, or it could just be spent time in a park, or it could even just be like looking at honestly images or videos of nature. So a lot of these also have included virtual nature interventions. And you see that people show physiological changes that are associated with a lowered stress response when they have been in natural spaces. So things like dropping, like cortisol dropping, heart rate slowing, those sorts of like physiological metrics. You can actually see those change as a consequence of interacting with nature. And then there's this like other kind of separate, there's other things that are related, which is this idea of like subjective vitality. So people feeling like energized, happy, kind of, right? Like invigorated is another benefit that we see from interacting with nature. And I think you talked probably about this with Kate last week, but it increases your connectedness to other people and to your surroundings, which is a great thing in and of itself. And then that also I'll also tack on that like green exercise is better than like indoor exercise for emotional states as well. So if you can exercise outdoors in a natural space, that's like what we love.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I made so many friends on that hike last week. So I just love how people in the early morning, everyone's just like, hey, good morning. How you going? And I was like, we don't do that in the city.
No, we do not.
That's considered weird in the city. Like if you say hi to someone on the street, you're like,
what? What? Are you?
What? Yeah. Are you okay?
Yeah.
So I just really love that you mentioned that social aspect. But I think it's just established how important this is to everyone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And with that, let's talk about practice, because we
Yeah.
know that it's important, but how do we get to the practical side of it? Because as we mentioned earlier, it's kind of like I don't know, like it's a journey for each person, especially if you're not in a space where you have access to nature. You don't have that privilege, or your life circumstances don't allow you to do that. Normally, the question would be related to how you would improve your connectedness to nature. But I think maybe we can tweak the question a little bit today, especially for those that are struggling. Because I think you already have a really good sense of connection with nature. So that would be, slightly unfair to those that are struggling. So I wonder, what would you recommend to those that are struggling right now if they don't know how to get connected to nature, or if they don't have the best circumstances in life to actually get access to nature? What should they do? What is the one thing that they can try today?
Well, I would have a hard time saying one thing, but I can give you a couple. So
yeah, let's do that.
So the first thing I would say is that like there's this idea of like noticing nature wherever it is. And so, there, even if it's not like a truly like immersive, beautiful place, like even in a city, like nature is all around us still. So if you try to, as you're walking around, you're going to walk tuning into those natural elements. So it could be like wildlife, or it could just be like grass on the sidewalk, or like something like growing through the cracks, right? Like just kind of trying to notice those natural parts of your surroundings is like one small tweak you can make. There's also, if there just happens to be a street or some nearby area that just has more trees, just like try to go for a walk, or if you can walk to commute or do some errands, like if you can take a slightly greener, more tree-lined route, like that's great. That's what I used to do when I was, in grad school walking. I took a kind of roundabout. I took the scenic route, which was basically just like the street I walked on was like very lush compared to the rest of the streets in nearby. So I just like purposely took that route every time I would walk to campus, because it just like gave me a little extra nature exposure, and allowed me to connect to nature a little bit more easily than if I taken like a more direct path, but a like less natural one. And then the other thing I would say is like, if you're really struggling, or if it's like so gross out and you can't get outside for it, like some of my research basically showed that you can still get the emotional benefits of nature if you're looking at images, especially if they're really beautiful and really like this kind of the aesthetics of it and the beauty of it and the preference for it is one of the really key ingredients to having these emotional benefits. So if you can like just like watch like Planet Earth or like some sort of like a nature documentary, like that's it's not, it's not going to replace a walk in a forest preserve, but it's still going to help. And it's still going to make you feel connected to the natural world, I think, in a way that watching something else wouldn't. So those would be my tips.
Yeah, I love those tips. I mean, we would normally ask for one. You gave us a bunch. So there you go. Perfect.
Yep.
So these practices are all to help us to stay more connected to nature. We know the benefits already, so I don't think we need to repeat that. But I think there will be a lot of challenges for those that aren't used to this, because,
Totally.
For example, they might not have the time, or they might not want to make the time because they're so used to the daily grind,
right.
So yeah, how would you recommend them tips to overcome these challenges? And maybe there are some challenges that we haven't addressed yet. If we missed anything from the previous section, now's the time to throw them in to help our audience to get a bigger picture of what's actually going on.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say like challenges that I think of as someone who's almost always lived in like the northern part of the US is that like sometimes the weather outside is so bad and you can't convince me to go out into it.
Yeah,
and I would say that's really hard to overcome, especially if you don't like if you can gear up and just like spend any small amount of time outside is going to be good for you. So but that's like a barrier that I didn't bring up. That is like a very personal to me. I hate the extreme cold. So like in Chicago, it gets like frigid in winter. And so getting me to go outside in -20 is just like, that's not going to happen. But so maybe sometimes you can skip a little bit of time, maybe watch Planet Earth instead. But I would say that those kind of like it being extreme out aside, I think the number one barrier is, again, it's this idea of people not making time for it. Like, assuming you have some set of leisure time and you can choose to do something, choosing to do something in nature. And it could be as simple as like, you want to hang out with your friend, you haven't seen them in a while, instead of going to a coffee shop to catch up, let's go on a walk together through a natural space. Boom, two birds, one stone, right? You have spent time in nature and you're connecting with your friend. And so I'm a big fan of like combining things that I would otherwise be doing with trying to get some nature exposure. So, biking and hiking outdoors. If I'm trying to get some exercise in, I'm going to try to do it in a natural space if I can, or trying to, like make my commute a more natural one. So insofar as, you have to be going out and about doing things, like try to find ways to make the things that you already have to do overlap with natural spaces, or I don't know, just like decide instead of going to the movies, go for a hike, do a weekend trip where you just go go for hiking and biking or something like that, spending time in nature rather than going out to the bar or something like that. Like there are things you can do to replace current activities with like more beneficial activities. Yeah.
Absolutely. I love that. I actually recommended to my friend, hey, it's such a nice day. Why don't we hang out at the beach instead of your place? But then we had to cancel because she was sick. But this is exactly
that's the idea, though. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, this is exactly what you're talking about. I love that. Yeah. Okay. I'm on the right track.
You're totally on the right track. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. But the most important thing, I guess, is probably still outlining some benefits, especially with that practice where you talked about watching Planet Earth. I love watching Planet Earth. Our Planet, sorry, not Planet Earth. Maybe that's a documentary, but another one. But yeah, I love watching Our Planet. And there's another series on, I think on Disney Plus. It's called Earth Moods as well.
Oh, okay. I haven't seen that one. I don't have Disney Plus.
That's also interesting. It's just, sometimes I just like to zone out to it. Like I just sit in front of it and like I zone out, but it's really good. Yeah. But it's interesting you mentioned that, because how would that improve our connectedness with nature? Because in a way we're watching the screen, right? I do feel like I know more about our planet, but does it actually help us? If we don't get access to these natural spaces and someone just choose to, let's just say someone chooses to watch these documentaries exclusively, would that still help them?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that it's all about degrees, right? So like the most benefit that you're going to get from nature would be from like the most immersive, like natural, beautiful space you can find. That being said, given that that's not always an option, we do still see benefits in, especially emotional benefits from these like virtual, it's on a screen, but it's still looking at a natural place. We still see the benefits that you can see from going on a hike. They're smaller, right? So it's like, it's not a function of like, if you have the choice between watching Planet Earth and going for a hike, 10 times out of 10, I'm going to be like, yeah, if you can, go for the hike. But if you are not able to, and like all you have time for is like, I'm going to watch like some other random show, or I'm going to watch Planet Earth, I'm going to be like, probably watch Planet Earth, or I'm going to like, like, I don't know. I just think we know that the emotional benefits can be obtained even through kind of these simulated virtual nature exposure. So like any way you can get it is going to hopefully help. It just, the degree to which it helps is going to be smaller relative to a real natural space.
Yeah, totally. But it's good. It's good though. It's baby steps, right? I think it's totally just a matter of changing our perspective. We have access to, everyone has access to the internet today, I hope. So, at least we can start from there.
Totally. Yeah,
there you go.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow, such great tips. I love that. Yeah. It's a reminder that I need to watch it more. I finished the first season. I think I stopped. So I'm going to get back into it.
Yeah, get back on that. Yeah.
Yeah. I actually loved watching National Geographic as a child. So I think that's probably why I'm okay with this. But for a lot of other people, they might not be like, huh, what's that? So yeah, this is the reminder to everyone to watch it more in general, I would say.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, like the cinematography and like a lot of those shows, they like really do like capture stunning, like even if you have access to real nature, most of us don't have access to kind of like the incredible places that are usually featured in these kinds of like the documentaries are like like the best of the best places on the planet in terms of scenic beauty or uniqueness. And so like assuming that we can't actually just like hop on a plane and go to all these places, like it's not like perfect, but it's a good substitute, if not like an absolutely great one, especially if we don't have the real one at our disposal.
Totally. Yeah, that's a really good point. There you go. We can incorporate this into our daily lives really easily. You know, it's not that hard.
No.
All right. Thank you so much for sharing. I've learned so much today. Affective benefits. I'm not going to forget that. That's very interesting. I was like, what is that word? Like,
yeah,
like,
I know. It's such an academic $5 word for emotion.
Okay. Well, good to know. But then you also know I'm not an academic. So there you go.
Good.
Yeah. Oh, good. So finally, before we let you go, we would love to invite you to talk about something that you're very passionate about. I know exactly what you're passionate about by this point, but I would love to hear from you. You know, maybe it'll come with a key message they want to share with our audience, something you didn't get to mention before. So the floor is yours.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that I kind of brought up two things in mind. So like one was like I've really fallen in love with like gravel cycling since I've moved out to Washington. Like I find it as just like a very easy way to connect with nature and also get exercise in. And there's so many things about it I love. So I just want to give like an extra plug real quick to nature cycling. But the other thing, and a lot of like, I'm not going to say that this has like been something I've been doing for such a long time that I can be like, yes, I did this thing and it changed my life. This is something I started doing like probably within the past, like meaningfully and regularly within the past few months. And that's like doing a very like a twice a day, basically gratitude journaling exercise where I, in the morning, I essentially try to spend like a good 5 to 10 minutes just like writing down different things I'm grateful for. And I try to come up with new things also every day. Like, so I can have some things that I've mentioned before, but then I like really like try to rack my brain. I'm like, okay, what's another thing I'm grateful for that I didn't write in the past like 5 or 7 days or whatever. And just like the act of kind of like going through my day and thinking about all of the things that I might otherwise take for granted that are actually not a given at all. Just like the big things and the small things. It has really allowed me to kind of, I think, keep my mindset very like focusing on the things I have and the things that I've been like lucky to experience and spending less time ruminating on the things that annoy me, right? Because it's like, there's always going to be things that annoy you. And so I think this practice has really made me a lot more optimistic. It's made me appreciate the mundane a lot more. And I just find that it keeps me in a really good mood. Like it's hard to, some days it's harder than others. Don't get me wrong. Like days where I wake up and I'm crabby, it takes a lot longer to list out things than days where I wake up in a great mood, but it still helps me. And I, like I said, I've been doing this for a couple of months and I really do feel like it has like shifted my outlook already, but I guess, you know, I gotta keep doing it. Check back to me in a year, see if I'm still doing that as well.
Yeah, well, that's a really good one because that practice is actually recommended by a lot of our guests. You know, like writing down gratitude list or journaling. Not the cycling part. That's unique to you so far. I think you're the first one that's mentioned that. But yeah, the gratitude practice it's not that hard, but you know, I find it challenging to keep up.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. So another maybe one thing I'll throw in to recommend to others is have a friend who you can do that with. You know, I have a really like one of my best friends who I love so much. And we just text each other our gratitude list.
Yeah.
And that keeps us accountable because, like some days I'm in a rush and I don't necessarily have the time to sit down at my desk and write it first thing in the morning. And I'm just like running from one place to the other. But, like in the middle of the day, if I remember and if she remembers, we would just text each other our list. And I feel like that's such a great way to stay in touch.
I love that. Yeah.
Sharing, like what you're grateful for and just putting things into perspective. It's been really helpful for me. Like we don't do that every day. We might do it every other day, but it's so helpful. I really love it.
Oh, I love that. And like such a part of it, at least for me, is also like when I reflect on like all the things I'm grateful for and the people that I find myself also more motivated to like tell them. So I feel like in addition, it's like the gratitude practice also makes me more likely to reach out to people and be like, hey, like, I really appreciate you and value you. And I just wanted you to know, like, I would just never do that before. And I feel like I've increasingly started to do that as a consequence. So it really does, like, it makes you value your relationships. And so if you can have that with like a friend where you guys are like, we're going to swap our gratitude list, like be accountable and also share like the great things about your lives with one another. Like, I just love that. Everything about that is awesome.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you so much for coming and share your insights today. As I said, we talked to Kate last week, but this conversation is completely different. We've learned a lot of new things. Well, there are some similarities. If you listen to the 2 episodes, you guys share some very similar things here and there, but overall the ideas are different in terms of the angle of the conversation. So, we keep learning about this stuff, and it's a really good reminder because, when you get really busy, the last thing you do is go out into nature. So
totally. Yeah.
I guess every little bit of a reminder.
Absolutely.
So if our listeners would like to find out more about your work or get in touch with you or, have a collaboration in mind, how can they find out about you?
Yeah. So you can Google my name. I'm, as far as I can tell, the only person with my name on the internet.
That's super unique. I love that.
I know. I actually, that's why I ended up taking my spouse's name when we got married. I was like, this is unique. This is search engine optimization ideal.
Wow. I love that.
That is the real reason. I'm not going to lie. Lewis is super common. But yeah, so easy to Google me. But I'm also on Twitter at Kim_Meidenbauer. And you can also find me on my Washington State University webpage. So if you just Google me and WSU, you should come across my stuff. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I had the best time.
Oh,
thanks for the reminder to go out into nature and watch more of Our Planet and David Attenborough documentaries.
Love David Attenborough.
Oh, yeah.
You've been listening to Doing Well, the Wellbeing Science Insights Podcast, produced by the Wellbeing Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, share, and subscribe to our channel so that other people can find it and we can continue to provide quality content. More of our work can be found on our website at we.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Lu Ngo. Thanks for tuning in.